"You're not wearing a coat," said a soft, almost hesitant voice that emerged through the icy night wind. Alexander slowly lifted his eyes. He was sitting on the metal bench at the bus stop, completely still, as if the frost had fused his clothes to the cold steel. The gusts of wind came in waves, cutting through skin and making his exposed hands burn. He didn't answer immediately, only raised a vacant gaze toward the woman approaching. Eleanor stood before him, clutching her worn canvas bag tightly against her body. She wore faded jeans, old boots, and a long grey wool coat, clearly not new but sturdy enough for the winter blanketing the coastal town. Her brown eyes, teary from the wind, settled on him in surprise. A man sitting with no protection, just a dress shirt, a loose tie, and a suit jacket tossed beside him, soaked in snow. "You're going to freeze like that?" she added, taking a step forward. Alexander let out a short, hoarse laugh, more ironic than amused. "Maybe that's exactly what I deserve." His voice was steady, but his lips were already trembling from the cold. Eleanor watched him in silence for a few seconds. Something about the scene felt off. He didn't look like someone living on the streets. His haircut, the elegant wristwatch, the leather briefcase next to the bench. Everything hinted at someone who, at the very least, had resources. And yet here he was, sitting like he had nowhere to go. She sighed, took a deep breath to overcome her hesitation, and removed her own coat. The wind hit her bare arms instantly, but she stepped forward and held it out. "Take it," she said firmly. Alexander's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Of course I am." Eleanor forced a brief smile. "Put it on." He looked at the coat like it was a strange object. A stranger in the middle of winter, offering the only protection she had against the cold. Alexander hesitated. He had enough money to buy dozens of coats, just like that one, but in that moment, he seemed incapable of even standing. "You shouldn't," he murmured. "I should," Elena interrupted, holding the coat closer to him. "It doesn't make sense for me to stay warm while you sit there like that." The wind blew again, almost as if to emphasize her words. With a slow motion, Alexander reached out his hand. The touch was unintentional, but Eleanor felt the near unbearable coldness of his skin. He pulled the coat toward him and, still somewhat clumsily, draped it over his shoulders. The fabric smelled of plain soap, something homely, something human. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling warmth slowly return. A shiver ran down his spine, not just from the lingering cold, but from the unexpected gesture. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said softly. Elena crossed her now bare arms, shrinking into herself against the wind. "You don't need to thank me. I just didn't want to watch someone get sick right in front of me." Silence fell over the bus stop. The snow came down in heavy flakes, illuminated by the flickering street lamp that buzzed with electricity. Elena remained standing, trying to fight off the cold without her coat. Alexander watched her from the corner of his eye. There was something intriguing about her, an ordinary woman who didn't recognize him, who wasn't impressed by anything beyond the human condition before her. He cleared his throat. "What's your name?" "Eleanor," she replied without much thought. "Elena," he repeated, as if tasting a new flavor. "I'm Alexander." She simply nodded. "Nice to meet you, Alexander." The bus was taking a long time to arrive. The wind didn't let up. Alexander, used to dinners in gilded halls and chauffeurs always waiting at his door, now sat there with a stranger's coat draped over his shoulders. He felt vulnerable, and at the same time, strangely alive. Elena, trying to warm her hands by blowing on them, stole a quick glance at him. "You don't seem like you're from around this neighborhood." "No," he answered slowly. "I'm not." And he wasn't lying. That part of the city, modest, far from the five-star hotels and glass skyscrapers, had never been part of his world. But something had brought him there that night, something he couldn't quite explain. A creaking sound in the distance signaled the bus's approach. Elena sighed in relief. Alexander, on the other hand, felt a strange tightness in his chest. He didn't want that brief interaction to end. When the vehicle came to a stop, she turned to him. "Do you have somewhere to go?" He hesitated, heart pounding. A millionaire, owner of everything, yet speechless before a simple question. He finally answered, "There's always somewhere." But it sounded hollow, unconvincing. Eleanor bit her lip. She reached into her bag, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and quickly scribbled a number. "Here, in case you need anything." Alexander took the paper, folding it slowly. "You didn't have to." "I already told you I did," she replied, with a firmness that ended the conversation. The driver rushed her with a glance. Eleanor climbed the bus steps, settling in without her coat, feeling the cold pierce through to her bones. Before the door shut, she looked back one last time. Alexander stood frozen, holding her coat tightly to his chest. The bus drove off. He remained alone, watching the red lights disappear into the night. He slipped the paper into his pocket and took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, something inside him, something forgotten, had begun to stir again. The snow kept falling, covering the deserted streets of the small coastal town. But Alexander was no longer trembling just from the cold. He trembled from a new, sudden feeling that had emerged the moment that woman said, "Take my coat." As he slowly walked down the sidewalk, he felt the weight of her gesture. It wasn't just a piece of grey wool. It was humanity. It was warmth. It was life. And without knowing why, Alexander already knew he couldn't let that slip away. "Mr. Carter, dinner is served," said the housekeeper, discreetly opening the door to the living room. Alexander slowly lifted his face. He was sitting on the dark brown leather sofa, elbows resting on his knees, staring intently at the crackling fireplace in front of him. The entire mansion was silent, except for the dry crackle of the flames and the distant echo of wind rattling the windows. He didn't respond to the woman, just gave a barely perceptible nod. The housekeeper waited for a few seconds, expecting him to get up, but he didn't move. With a quiet sigh, she stepped back and closed the door again. Alexander remained alone, surrounded by walls lined with expensive paintings, shelves of rare wines, and flawless furniture. None of it seemed to bring warmth. None of it filled the emptiness. He ran a hand over his face, rubbing his eyes. He could still smell the coat in his hands, as if the simple fabric was still resting on his shoulders. That unexpected gesture from Elena, the unknown woman who had given him her only protection against the cold, came back like a ghost. He had dozens of coats in his closet, some never even worn, but none of them carried that weight of humanity. He stood and walked slowly to the mansion's grand hall. The automatic lights flicked on as he passed, revealing the gleam of polished marble and the sparkle of chandeliers. His footsteps echoed, solitary. On the main wall, a painted portrait of his father looked down on him with stern eyes. "You did it, Alex," he muttered to himself, staring at the painting. "You got everything you wanted." Everything. Hotels across 3 continents, investments that earned more in a week than most people made in years, invitations to the most exclusive dinners. He had power, fame, money, but no warmth, no truth. That night, when Eleanor placed her coat on his shoulders, something inside him cracked. Why would an ordinary woman do that? Why risk being cold to keep a stranger warm? Alexander couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for him without expecting anything in return. He walked to the dining room. The table was set for one, as always. Porcelain plates, silver cutlery, a napkin folded into a geometric shape. The main course steamed at the center but looked tasteless just sitting there. He sat down mechanically, cut a small piece, and chewed slowly. Nothing filled the void. Around him, the silence consumed everything. In the past, this table was filled with his father, his mother, the noise of business discussions. He had grown up in that environment, learning early on that emotions were weaknesses. His father used to say, "Open hearts don't sign contracts. Cold heads build empires." He had followed that mantra for years, turning his inheritance into something even greater. But with each victory, the table felt emptier. He pushed the plate aside and got up again. He climbed the wide marble staircase to the second floor, passing walls decorated with photographs from grand openings, cocktail events, and international trips. In every photo, he appeared smiling, surrounded by equally smiling people. But he knew they were just masks. In his bedroom, he loosened his tie and tossed it onto the king-size bed. The silence was suffocating. He walked over to the panoramic window and pulled back the curtains. Outside, the coastal city stretched to the horizon, dotted with distant lights. The dark sea reflected the moon, and the strong breeze shook the trees in the mansion's garden. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass. He remembered Elena's gaze, steady, determined, when she said it made no sense for him to be left out in the cold. That sentence echoed inside him. Alexander, so used to flattery, favors, and forced compliments, had heard, perhaps for the first time in years, a sincere voice free of any agenda. He turned and walked to the closet. He opened the wide doors, revealing rows of tailored suits, color-coded ties, and shelves of Italian shoes. In the corner, coats, long, expensive, made of fine wool and leather, some still with tags. He ran his fingers across each one, but none reminded him of Elena's grey coat. None held meaning. He closed his eyes. He thought back to his life of achievements. From a young age, he was shaped to win. He studied at the best schools, went on business trips with his father before turning 18, took on responsibilities too early. He grew up believing success was the key to happiness. He built empires, raised skyscrapers, opened luxury resorts on tropical islands. But every time he came home, he was greeted by silence. The women who passed through his life had always been drawn to his wealth. Beautiful, sophisticated, but they all left once they realized he never opened up. He never allowed himself to. His heart remained locked away, protected by walls built over the years. Until one ordinary woman on a cold street, who knew nothing about who he was, who had no idea of the power he held, handed him her coat without asking for a thing. Alexander took a deep breath and shut the closet firmly. He walked back to the bed, lay down fully dressed, and stared at the dark ceiling. In the silence, he realized how much his life, built on numbers and contracts, lacked humanity. He spent nearly the entire night awake, thinking of Elena's face, thinking of the way she held out her coat with such certainty, of the cold she must have felt after giving it to him, of the crumpled paper with a number now tucked in his wallet. He could call, he could say thank you. But he didn't. Not yet. At dawn, sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting light across the silent mansion. Alexander got up slowly, walked through the long hallway, and stepped into the garden. Dew shimmered on the manicured grass. He sat on the stone bench, hands on his knees, and closed his eyes. He had never felt so deeply affected by such a simple gesture, never been so disturbed by something so small. A grey wool coat, worn by use, had now become a symbol of something he couldn't buy: sincerity. At that moment, Alexander realized he had acquired everything money could buy, and yet, paradoxically, he had never felt so poor. And it was precisely that poverty that Elena's eyes had revealed, not with judgment, not with pity, but with humanity. From that morning on, he knew he couldn't forget. And no matter how hard he tried to return to the rhythm of contracts, meetings, and figures, the cold of that night and the warmth of that coat would continue burning inside him. The millionaire who had everything had just discovered he was missing the one thing that mattered most. "Eleanor, you're late again." The voice, soft but worried, came from the corner of the small kitchen. The young woman dropped her worn bag onto the chair and took a deep breath, pulling off the shoes soaked with snow. The apartment floor was cold, the heater barely worked, and the peeling walls let in the winter wind. Still, this was what they called home. At the Formica table, Lucia, her younger sister, looked at her with tired eyes. "I know, Lucia," Elena replied, pulling the hair tie loose to free the stubborn strands. "The bus took forever, and I had to walk the rest of the way." Lucia crossed her arms, wrapping herself in her frayed hoodie. "You should have worn your coat. Are you without it again?" Elena looked away for a moment. She hadn't told her sister what had happened the night before, when she gave her coat to a stranger shivering in the snow. The gesture had felt natural, almost instinctive. But now, with the cold pressing against her own skin, she felt the weight of that choice. "The coat," she murmured, searching for an excuse. "I had to lend it out. I'll explain later." Lucia sighed but didn't press. She was used to her sister's vague answers. Since their mother died years ago, Elena had taken on all the responsibilities. She kept the house running, paid the bills, protected the girl from hardship. At just 18, Lucia was still in school, and Elena did everything she could to make sure she stayed there. Elena opened the kitchen cabinet and pulled out a pot. The metallic clatter echoed in the small space. She poured in some rice to cook, then added heated beans from a takeout container she'd brought from the community center. The meal was simple, but enough. As she stirred the pot, her mind drifted to the past. She thought of their mother, who worked as a seamstress from home, always surrounded by fabric and colorful threads. She was the one who told bedtime stories while the two girls shared the same bed. Their father, a fisherman, had died too soon, lost in a storm at sea. Their mother had been left to support the two girls with dignity and hard work. When illness came, everything crumbled quickly. No insurance, no savings. Eleanor had watched her mother wither before her eyes. At 20, she dropped out of her teaching degree to work wherever she could: grocery stores, cafes, schools, any temp job that opened up. Her younger sister, only 12 at the time, cried in secret, but Elena never let her give up on her dreams. The hiss of the pot pulled her back to the present. She served their food and sat down at the table with Lucia. Her sister watched her curiously, sensing Elena's distant expression. "You're acting weird," the girl said. "Did something happen?" Elena hesitated. She thought about telling her what had happened at the bus stop, that the night's chill had been broken not by the wind, but by the strange sense of having done the right thing. But she kept it to herself. She didn't want to spark questions or hopes. "Just tired," she answered, forcing a smile. "But everything's fine." They ate in silence. The clock showed nearly 10 at night. Outside, the distant hum of cars and the whistle of a train reminded them that life marched on, indifferent to their struggle. When they finished, Elena cleared the dishes and washed them, as she always did. Later, she stepped into the small bedroom they shared. The walls were covered in posters Lucia had taped up, bands, motivational quotes torn from old magazines. Elena sat on the bed and pulled a wooden box from underneath. Inside were a few keepsakes: a faded photo of their mother holding the two girls when they were little, a school medal she'd won for writing, and a substitute teacher badge from a school where she'd worked for a few months. She ran her fingers over the badge and sighed. Teaching had been her passion, her calling. She loved seeing children's eyes light up when they learned something new. But stability never came. Temporary contracts, budget cuts, schools shutting down classes. Now only her volunteer work at the community center remained, where she taught neighborhood kids to read and write. She received only small donations in return, but she couldn't give it up. Lucia lay beside her, pulling up the thin blanket. "You should think about yourself too, Elena. You can't carry the whole world alone." The older sister smiled, gently stroking her sister's hair. "I am thinking about myself. You're my world." Silence settled over the room. Elena closed her eyes, but the images returned. The man at the bus stop, his trembling breath, the vacant stare. She could still feel the cold in her arms, but also the warmth of having done what she believed was right. She didn't know who he was, where he came from, or if she would ever see him again. But something told her that night hadn't just been a random moment. The next morning, she got up early. Weak sunlight slipped through the window. She put on the same jeans, a plain sweater, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders to face the cold on the way to the community center. Before leaving, she paused in front of the cracked mirror in the living room. She looked at her reflection. Dark circles under her eyes, messy hair, simple clothes. She smiled at herself, as if trying to summon strength. "It'll be okay," she whispered, before closing the door behind her. The community center was just a few blocks away, in an old red brick building. The courtyard was full of children running, laughing loudly, undeterred by the cold. Elena entered through the side door, greeted with hugs and smiles. Despite the hardships, this was where she found purpose. She sat in the makeshift classroom, where scratched wooden tables served as desks. She picked up the donated books, opened to the alphabet, and began to teach. The children repeated the letters with enthusiasm, some laughing at their mistakes, others beaming with pride when they got it right. Elena smiled at every small victory, feeling her heart grow warmer. But deep down, a memory wouldn't let her go. The face of the man at the bus stop, the way he clutched the coat like it was something precious. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It didn't make sense to cling to a stranger. And yet the image returned, persistent, as if fate had left an invisible mark. When class ended, she packed up the materials and stepped outside into the courtyard. The cold wind wrapped around her again, reminding her of the missing coat. She shrank into herself, pulling the blanket tighter. She watched the children running, laughing, playing, and felt a mix of hope and melancholy. Eleanor knew her life was made of quiet battles, buried pain, and responsibilities that often weighed her down. But she also knew she still had something to offer: compassion, knowledge, human warmth. And maybe, just maybe, that night at the bus stop had proven that even when you have little, you can still give so much. She took a deep breath, lifted her face to the wind, and smiled to herself. The fight would go on, as always. But now, somewhere in the city, someone was wearing her coat. And that simple thought, though it didn't solve her problems, lit a small spark of meaning amid the cold. "I need you to find someone," said Alexander, straight to the point, his voice firm but laced with urgency. Charles Bennett, his trusted assistant for over a decade, looked up from the reports he was reviewing on his tablet. His employer's tone was not the usual. This wasn't about business, nor did it seem to involve a new investment or a corporate rival. Alexander's gaze was distant, almost unsettled, something that happened rarely. "Someone?" Charles repeated, leaning forward. "Who exactly?" Alexander took a deep breath, pacing across the wide, glass-walled office. From up high, the coastal city stretched out like a blanket of lights. The wall clock read nearly midnight, yet Alexander was still there, impeccably dressed, but visibly restless. "A woman," he said after a few seconds. "She approached me on the street last night." Charles frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, that's very vague." "I know," Alexander interrupted, stopping in front of the window. "All I have is her first name, Elena, and a grey coat she gave me." Silence filled the room for a few moments. Charles closed his tablet and took a deep breath. He was used to his boss's eccentricities, but rarely had he seen him this serious. "All right," he said finally. "Tell me exactly what happened." Alexander recounted everything in detail: the deserted bus stop, the falling snow, the biting cold, and the woman who, without hesitation, took off her coat and gave it to him. As he spoke, his voice changed. He was no longer the confident millionaire, owner of hotels and resorts, just a man describing a gesture that had completely disarmed him. Charles listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Alexander finished, the assistant rubbed his chin and said, "If she gave you a phone number, it would be simpler to just call her." Alexander pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his wallet, the number scribbled quickly across it. He looked at it as if it were a treasure, but didn't hand it to Charles. "Not yet," he said, putting it back. "I don't want to take that risk. I need to know who she really is, understand her before I make contact." Charles raised an eyebrow. "So you want me to find her without using the number?" "Exactly," Alexander confirmed. "Use our resources. I know it can be done." The assistant sighed. He was used to tracking down hard-to-reach entrepreneurs, tech developers hidden in remote cities, even reclusive artists for marketing partnerships. Finding an ordinary woman in a single city wasn't impossible, but he noticed that his boss's request went beyond simple curiosity. "All right," he finally said. "I'll take care of it." In the following days, Charles set his team in motion. They reviewed traffic camera footage near the bus stop Alexander had described around 8:30 p.m. the previous night. They found blurred images, but in one, a female figure wrapped in a grey wool coat appeared boarding a bus. With patience, they traced that vehicle's route through the next stops. Cross-referenced security camera footage caught sight of Elena again, this time walking down a narrow street in a modest neighborhood. Charles gathered the data, but wanted to be certain before presenting anything to Alexander. He dispatched 2 discreet aides to confirm. They found that the woman lived with her younger sister in a small rented apartment. She volunteered as a teacher at a local community center and worked temporary jobs to supplement her income. On the 3rd night since the initial request, Charles walked into Alexander's office with a slim folder. The millionaire was already waiting, standing near the window, just like the first night. "Did you find her?" he asked before Charles could even sit. "Yes," Charles replied, opening the folder. "Her name is Elena Rivera, 28 years old, a trained teacher, currently unemployed, lives with her sister Lucia in a working-class neighborhood in the north end of the city, spends part of her time volunteering at a community center for children." Alexander took the documents, flipping through each page attentively. There were images from security cameras, public records, even an old-school ID badge found in an online database. Each detail seemed to fill a gap in the puzzle that had consumed him since that night. "So she's real," he murmured, more to himself than to Charles. "She didn't expect anything in return." "From what we gathered, sir, it appears not," the assistant confirmed. "She's just someone living a simple life." Alexander closed the folder and took a deep breath. He walked over to the leather armchair and sat down, elbows resting on his knees. "I want to see her," he said firmly. "I need to talk to her again." Charles hesitated. "I could arrange for a formal invitation, perhaps a dinner, or have her brought here to the office." "No," Alexander cut him off. "That's not how this should go. This isn't a contract, it's not a negotiation. I need to go to her." The assistant studied him carefully. He knew Alexander like few did. He knew this man rarely let cracks show in his armor. But now he saw him vulnerable, driven in a completely different way. "Then I'll make it happen," he replied, offering no further objection. The next morning, a black car slipped discreetly through the quiet streets of the north side. The driver slowed in front of a modest brick building. Alexander in the back seat watched through the window. His heart pounded, a rhythm that even billion-dollar meetings had never managed to provoke. "This is it?" he asked in a low voice. Yes, sir, Charles confirmed. She comes and goes from this building every day. Yesterday, she was at the community center until late afternoon. Alexander took a deep breath. He held the gray coat folded on his lap, the same one she had placed on his shoulders. He squeezed the fabric between his fingers, feeling its coarse texture, the simple scent of soap. All right, he said, opening the door. Now it's up to me. And he stepped out into the morning chill, leaving behind the comfort of the car. In front of the humble building, the millionaire who had everything prepared to take the first step into the world of a woman who, with a single gesture, had shaken the foundations of his life. Elena. The male voice echoed down the narrow hallway of the community center, blending with the sound of children's laughter and hurried footsteps. She looked up immediately, startled. She was crouched beside one of the tables, helping a boy write the letter M in his notebook, when she recognized the figure standing at the door. Her heart raced before her mind could even register what she was seeing. Alexander was there, standing tall, imposing yet completely out of place in that colorful room, with walls covered in drawings and makeshift posters. He wore an elegant dark coat, but what caught Elena's attention most was the gray fabric folded in his arms. Her coat. "You?" she murmured, unable to hide her surprise. Some of the children stopped playing and looked at him curiously, as if a character had stepped out of another world and into their own. Elena stood slowly, trying to collect her thoughts as his presence filled the room. Alexander hesitated for a moment. For the first time in years, he had no rehearsed lines, no planned introduction. He simply held up the coat in his hands. "I believe this belongs to you." Elena blinked a few times, still in disbelief. She took a few steps toward him, stopping a few feet away. The coat was clean, carefully folded, but that hardly mattered to her. What puzzled her was, why was he there? "You didn't have to come all the way here just for that," she said, her voice quiet, almost wary. "I wasn't expecting anything." Alexander took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I know, but this isn't just about the coat." Dun. The silence between them was almost tangible. Elena crossed her arms, guarding herself, and looked him in the eye. He held her gaze, once again feeling that unexpected strength in her. "Then why did you come?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about what you did. You didn't know me. You had no idea who I was. And still, you gave me something that was yours, without asking for anything in return." Elena frowned, trying to understand. She was used to helping people without expecting anything back. It was part of her daily life at the community center. But no one had ever reacted like this before, as if a simple gesture had shifted something deep inside them. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied. "You were freezing." "No." Alexander shook his head slowly. "Not everyone would." His gaze was intense, almost uncomfortably so. Elena looked away briefly, feeling the weight of his words. The children returned to their play, as if the silence between the two adults was just background noise to their joy. Alexander took a step forward, extending the coat. "I came to return this, but also to say thank you." She took the coat slowly, holding it against her chest. The smell of soap had been replaced with something different, yet still familiar. Holding it again felt strange. It no longer seemed like just a piece of wool, but rather an invisible thread connecting her to the man who now stood in front of her with such intensity. "You didn't have to thank me," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "I did it because it felt right." He took a deep breath, his eyes still locked on hers. "Exactly." Elena felt a growing unease. She didn't know who he really was, but his posture, his clothes, the way he spoke, all of it revealed he came from a world entirely different from hers, and that set off every alarm inside her. "You don't seem like someone who rides the bus," she said, raising an eyebrow. Alexander let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "No, I'm not." She narrowed her eyes. "Then what were you doing there, alone without a coat that night?" He hesitated, glancing away for a moment. "I needed to breathe, get away from everything." Elena didn't respond. She just looked at him, waiting for more, but he didn't continue. He was holding back. She could see that. Sensing her doubt, Alexander tried to soften the moment. Can I see you again?" Elena almost laughed, incredulous. "I don't get it. You don't even know me." "That's exactly why," he replied, steady. "I want to." Her heart skipped a beat, but her rational side pulled her back. "Look around," she said, gesturing to the room full of children and worn-out desks. "This is my world. I don't know what yours looks like, but I'm pretty sure it's nothing like this." Alexander met her gaze with sincerity. "That doesn't matter to me." She stood in silence, surprised by his conviction. The children ran by again, calling her name, asking for help with the drawing. Elena turned toward them, breathing deeply, trying to regain control. "I have work to do," she said firmly. "Thank you for returning the coat." Alexander stepped back, understanding the message. But before he left, he spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "It's not just about the coat, Elena. I won't forget." And then he turned, walking down the colorful hallway until he disappeared through the door. Elena stood there, holding the coat in her arms, her heart pounding and her mind spinning. She wasn't sure what to think. Part of her wanted to dismiss the encounter as fleeting, but another part, deeper, quieter, knew something had begun on that cold night, and now inevitably it was growing. As she turned her attention back to the children, she still felt his presence, like an invisible imprint. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man hadn't entered her life by chance. "I can't stop thinking about you." The confession slipped from Alexander's mouth suddenly, breaking the silence of the night. Elena froze mid-step, her footsteps echoing on the damp sidewalk. She had just closed the door of the community center, clutching her bag to her chest, when he appeared again. She hadn't expected to find him there, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp, hands in his pockets, as if he'd been waiting for hours. Her heart raced, but her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Did you follow me?" "No," he replied quickly, raising his hands in surrender. "I was passing by." Elena let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Passing by? In this neighborhood? At this hour?" He didn't know how to explain without revealing too much. He took a deep breath, trying to sound sincere. "I wanted to see you again." Elena sighed and turned her face away. She felt a mix of anger and something she didn't want to admit, perhaps a touch of relief, maybe even hope. "Alexander, I don't know what you're looking for, but I have nothing to give you." He took a few steps closer, his voice softer now. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to be around you, to talk, to get to know who you really are." Elena gripped her bag tighter. His words sounded beautiful, but also dangerous. She could recognize the type, men with resources, charm, and time to turn someone's life upside down, and she couldn't afford to fall into illusions. "You don't understand," she murmured. "I have responsibilities. The kids count on me. I don't go to parties, I don't live a life of luxury. What you saw in me was just a gesture, that's all." Alexander stepped closer, and she caught a hint of his subtle cologne mixed with the scent of rain in the air. "Exactly. You did it without expecting anything. You didn't want to impress. You didn't ask for a single thing. That got to me." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to shield herself from his words. When she opened them, he was so close she could see the restless glint in his eyes. "You don't know who I am," she said firmly, "or what I've been through." "Then tell me," he said almost in a whisper. "Let me in, just a little." Her chest tightened. Her instinct told her to refuse, to push him away before it was too late. But there was something about Alexander that disarmed her. An unexpected sincerity, a vulnerability hidden beneath all that confident composure. "I can't," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but it came out more like a painful confession than a definitive no. Alexander sensed the crack in her armor. He didn't push. He simply took a step back, giving her space. "Then let me show you who I am. Give me a chance to prove I'm not playing games." Elena stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to read every line of his face, every intention behind his words. The silence between them was broken by the distant sound of a bus turning the corner. She took a deep breath and answered, without realizing she was giving in. "If you really want to prove something, show up here tomorrow. The kids need help with a presentation." Alexander blinked, surprised. "Me? Help kids?" Elena crossed her arms, daring him. "If you're not just another bored rich guy, you'll show up. If not, I'll have my answer." For a moment he seemed to consider it. Then a small, almost boyish smile tugged at his lips. "I'll be here." Elena shook her head, half in disbelief that she had just suggested such a thing. And yet, something inside her told her she needed to see him again, to find out whether this sudden feeling was real or just a passing illusion. She turned and started walking toward the bus stop, trying to put distance between herself and the intensity of the moment before it swallowed her whole. But as she walked, she could still feel his eyes following her, steady, full of promises that scared and pulled at her all at once. That night, when she finally lay down, she could still hear his words echoing, "I can't stop thinking about you." And against her own will, she realized she couldn't stop thinking about him either. "I can't believe you lied to me." Elena's voice trembled as it echoed through the hall, cutting through the quiet murmur of the luxurious room. Alexander, who had been standing next to two businessmen, turned around immediately. The confident smile he usually wore vanished the moment he saw Elena standing at the entrance, eyes brimming with tears and her body tense, as if barely able to contain the anger and pain. He took a step toward her, but she raised her hand to stop him. "Don't come any closer." An awkward silence fell over the room. The businessmen exchanged discreet glances and quietly stepped away, leaving the two of them alone. "Elena, please, listen to me," Alexander said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Listen to what?" she shot back, her heart pounding. "That all of this whole facade, this simple man who showed up on cold nights was a lie. That you were never just an ordinary guy, but a millionaire playing at being invisible." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if searching for strength. It wasn't a game. It never was. "Then what was it?" she asked, pain pouring out with every word. "You let me believe we were equals, that we had something real, but the truth is, there was a canyon between us." He stepped closer, ignoring her earlier gesture to stay away. His gaze was intense, filled with desperation. "What we had, Elena, was real. I hid who I was because I was scared. Scared that you'd never look at me the way you did that night. That you'd only see the money, the titles, the life I never asked for." Elena felt her chest tighten even more. His words carried weight, but the sting of betrayal still pulsed inside her. "You could have trusted me. I should have trusted you, I know." Alexander raised his voice, emotions spilling out. "But you don't know what it's like to be surrounded by people who only come close because they want something. For the first time, someone gave me something expecting nothing in return. You gave me your coat, Elena. You gave me warmth without knowing who I was. and I couldn't bear the thought of ruining that. The tears she tried to hold back finally escaped, sliding down her cheeks. But you ruined it anyway. He stood still, as if he'd been struck. The silence dragged on, heavy and suffocating. The distant sound of a glass being set on a table echoed like thunder in the tension hanging between them. Alexander took a deep breath and, in a desperate gesture, pulled off his expensive watch and threw it on the marble table. This isn't me. I'm not the money. I'm not the luxury. I'm the man who was shivering that night and felt his heart race when you said, "Here, take my coat, and that's who I am." Eleanor looked away, fighting the wave of emotions. His gesture, stripped of pride, touched her, but the pain of the lie still burned. "You wanted the truth," she said, her voice breaking. "The truth is, I don't know if I can trust you again." Alexander stepped forward until he was right in front of her, his eyes locked onto hers. "Then don't trust my words. Trust what I do. Give me a chance to show you I'm more than a rich man trying to impress you." She remained silent, struggling to breathe. The weight of the moment seemed to crush every fiber of her being. Part of her wanted to run, to shut the door forever. But another part, the part that remembered the warmth of his embrace on cold nights, hesitated. Elena wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a step back. "I need time." Alexander nodded slowly, his expression marked by the pain of someone who knew he might lose everything. "I'll wait, as long as it takes." She turned and walked toward the exit, her eyes still glassy. Every step felt impossibly heavy, but she didn't look back. She knew that if she did, she might not have the strength to walk away. Alexander remained there, unmoving, watching the door close behind her. His heart pounded, a storm of hope and fear. He understood he had shattered her trust, but he also knew that the love between them, though wounded, was still alive. In the silence that remained, only one certainty echoed inside him. He would do whatever it took to win Elena back, even if it meant giving up everything the world associated with his name. "Elena!" Alexander's voice echoed in the cold night air, laced with urgency and hope. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, her hands tucked inside the simple coat that meant so much to them both. Her heart jumped at the sound of his voice, but her mind still carried the ghosts of disappointment. Alexander approached with firm yet cautious steps, like a man walking on thin ice. His presence, an impeccable suit paired with a vulnerable expression, caught the attention of passers-by, but he didn't seem to notice. All he could see was Elena. "I had to find you," he said, his breath uneven. "I couldn't bear the thought of you walking away believing I was just a lie." Elena turned slowly. Her eyes were tired, but there was still a light in them, a flame that had refused to go out. "Alexander, I don't know if I can." He raised his hands, as if offering not just a gesture, but his whole heart. "I know I messed up. I know I failed to trust, but I can't let our story end like this. You have to believe me. Every word, every gesture, every look between us was real. The money, the titles, the status, none of that means anything when I'm with you." She stared at him in silence, and in that pause the wind picked up, blowing a strand of hair across her face. Alexander instinctively lifted a hand to move it aside, but stopped halfway, respecting her space. "I'm not here to win you back with empty promises," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to show you who I really am. Not the millionaire everyone sees, but the man who shivered in the cold that night and found in you the most genuine human gesture he's ever known." Eleanor took a deep breath, struggling with a swirl of pain and hope. "You lied, Alexander. You hid who you were. How can I believe it won't happen again?" He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "Because I've learned there's no love without truth. And if I lose you now, I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But if you give me a chance, just one, I promise to be honest in every detail, even when it scares me." The silence between them stretched endlessly. Elena felt her chest tighten, each heartbeat a tug of war between reason and emotion. Then, almost involuntarily, she whispered, "I still love you." Alexander closed his eyes, as if those words were the breath he'd been gasping for. "Then let me prove I'm worthy of that love." She took a step toward him, still hesitant. "Prove it how?" He slowly removed the family ring he wore, a symbol of generations and the fortune he'd inherited, and placed it in her palm. "By leaving all of it behind, if I have to. I'll walk away from the world I know, because none of it matters without you." Elena looked down at the ring, stunned by the weight of the gesture. It was as if Alexander was willing to strip himself of everything that defined him, just to stand before her as a man. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't from pain. She placed the ring back in his hand, gently closing his fingers around it. "I don't want you to give up who you are. I just want you to stop hiding from me. Let me be part of your whole life, not just the part you think I'll accept." Alexander pulled her into a gentle embrace, and she didn't resist. On the contrary, she melted into the warmth of it, as if it erased every mile between them. His heartbeat pounded against hers, and amid the city's distant noise, there was only the quiet comfort of two people finally finding each other. "I love you, Elena," he whispered into her hair, "more than anything." She closed her eyes, hearing the truth in his voice. "I love you too." They remained locked in that embrace, as if time had stopped just for them, and in that moment, the past, the lies, and the differences no longer mattered. All that mattered was the future they could build together, one grounded in trust and in the love that had survived every test. When they pulled back, Alexander cupped her face tenderly. "Can we start over?" Elena smiled through her tears, a shy smile, but full of hope. "Yes, let's." And so, under the dim glow of the street lamps and a cold that no longer mattered, they sealed that new beginning with a kiss. A kiss filled with promises and the certainty that, despite the scars, their love had triumphed. In that moment, Alexander was no longer just a millionaire, and Elena was no longer just an ordinary woman. They were two hearts that had found each other against all odds, and finally chose to walk side by side with no masks, no secrets. And that's how the story that began with a simple gesture, "Take my coat," became a love capable of breaking through any barrier. A true love, born in the cold,
what it meant to you.
Live in the warmth.
Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel. Really important. And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.